Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. We're dealing with Chapter 6 of the Law of Journalism and Mass Communication, dealing with protecting privacy. And we have made it all the way to intrusion as one of the torts that we're discussing. So we're going to be dealing with intrusion into seclusion and also intrusion by trespass. Intrusion into seclusion and intrusion by trespass are what I call the paparazzi torts. You've got someone who is putting themselves into the private space of someone else's life. Intrusion into seclusion is physically or technologically with intent disturbing somebody else's expectation of privacy or interfering with somebody else's solitude or meddling in a person's private affairs. It can be direct or indirect, and it could be in person or by using technology. So it could be the person physically coming to make this intrusion, or it could be done by drones or secret microphones or telescopic lenses. The standard for measuring whether this rises to a violation of privacy is whether this would offend a reasonable person. And if this information can be found through public records, then there really isn't a reasonable expectation of privacy. That's even with the use of drones or microphones or telescopic lenses. That doesn't mean that some other tort hasn't occurred and that there isn't some other cause of action that would be the basis for a lawsuit. So an example would be someone climbing up a tree to look over a 9-foot fence to take pictures of a family that is swimming in the backyard. There would be a reasonable expectation of privacy because they're in a space where they normally would not expect someone to look or take pictures or to have access to them. Intrusion into seclusion can apply to someone who has violated privacy by not going on someone else's property. So they haven't physically trespassed. Inclusion by trespass, that's intentionally entering onto private property without permission. And you've got the elements here for a plaintiff to make his or her case. The plaintiff had a reasonable expectation of privacy. Defendant intruded on the plaintiff's privacy intentionally, and the intrusion would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. So for trespass, this has to be on private property, not in a public space, and the intruder has to physically enter onto that space. Defenses can be consent, getting permission, and if it's in a public area, the person doesn't own that property, and so there's a lowered expectation as to privacy. That being said, courts have found that in certain places that it would be considered trespass, such as someone going to a restaurant. It depends on the character of the place and the character of the location. So not everything is fair game when it's a public area. So what's reasonable under the circumstances? Private road. Courts have held there's no reasonable expectation of privacy if it's a private road where other people have access to it. So if it's a gated community and permission needs to be obtained in order to access the private road, then that's a possibility for intrusion by trespass. But if other people have access to it, even if you have a no trespassing sign, it's possible for that access to be acceptable because there's no reasonable expectation of privacy there. Healthcare facilities and health clinics, there have been statutes making it illegal for anybody to come within 8 feet of the people entering the health clinic. As long as the law is written where it's not content-based for restricting speech, we would single out one group of people over another. As long as it's applied equally, then that has been held to be legal. It doesn't violate the Constitution, and it's considered a statutory form of trespass. That 8-foot bubble, if you will, creates that reasonable expectation of privacy. And so it becomes, per se, a violation of intrusion by trespass. Even with public areas, such as government land, that is not always public and accessible to everybody, such as naval bases. And in certain circumstances, such as an automobile accident, there's an expectation of privacy, such as when a patient is talking with medical personnel. That's considered private, even if it's in a public space. One of the things that the authors talk about is getting consent through deception and false pretenses. And it's legal for reporters to use deceit or to lie in order to gain entry to a place. So, in the cases where you see hidden cameras, where they're trying to do a quote-unquote sting operation, such as patients in an eye clinic or mechanics in a garage, or a food critic posing as a customer in a restaurant, the deception where a reporter passes him or herself off as something other than what he or she is really, a journalist, is still legal. In other words, the deception does not negate the consent. It does not invalidate it. Now, it's one thing to use deception, to use deceit in order to get into a business place, and using deception in order to get access to a residence. You are probably going to fall on the wrong side of the law if you try and do that to access somebody's house. The First Amendment is not a license to trespass, and in the moment, trying to explain that to the police officer as you're standing in somebody's house, it could be a bad situation. You might have a bad day. All right, that gets us through intrusion, and we're going to move on to private facts in the next video.